Hi there, welcome to GXS Lab, Accountability Revolution in Sport Media, the Out on Air panel. I am so excited to be here chatting with all of the panelists today because this has been, actually Scott just reminded, it's actually more than a year. It's 14 months ago since we were all together at the Catalyst at Ryerson University for the first Out on Air. So we have all of our guest speakers today are Scott MacArthur, Devin Heroux, Anastasia Bucsis, and Richard Coffey, and of course the founder and the person who owns, I always like to say this from marketing terms, the intellectual property of Out on Air, Joe Recupero. Joe, I'm going to send it over to you for opening remarks.
Okay, thank you very much, Laurel. I just want to thank Laurel and her amazing team of students at the GXS Lab for putting on this incredible virtual conference today. I've been watching the earlier bits that went on and the panels that went on earlier today, and I'm looking forward to the closing remarks later, but very specifically looking forward to this panel. And it's because this is a very timely subject, and accountability in society, in particular in sports media, is long overdue. I started working in the sports broadcasting industry over 30 years ago, and back then there was zero representation on air in positions of power in sports from the LGBTQ plus community. You know, homophobia and homophobic slurs were a common occurrence back in the 80s, 90s, and even early 2000s, and in society, and particularly in sports in the media industry. So this idea of this kind of panel, and now 2 years in a row, would have been unheard of back then. It would have been a fantasy. There was no representation and no one questioned it back then. But in the last few years, I've really seen how transformative representation is and can be, and why it's important. So I've seen a lot of changes in the industry, you know, the good and the bad. And in the last 5 to 10 years, there's been a gradual shift and change in mindsets and attitudes. And I give a lot of that credit to these three people, part of the panel, who are out on air. You know, Scott MacArthur, Anastasia Bucsis, and Devin Heroux, who are still the only openly 3 out network on-air sports broadcasters and reporters working in this country. If there are more, I'm not aware of it, and maybe they're not out, we don't know, but these are the only 3 right now that we know of. And that's still not enough. We need to see more representation, not just on air, but in the boardrooms and executive and senior producer ranks, and in the hiring and editorial decision-making process. Last year, for the first Out on Air, we were all about awareness, and we had a diverse audience of LGBTQ plus people, as well as cisgender straight people from the sports and media worlds. And many of those people left with new perspectives. I also thought it was important for Laurel to be the moderator last year and this year, not only to add gender equity to the panel, but to have an ally outside the community to ask questions, because I firmly believe this is not just an LGBTQ plus community issue and ours to solve. Creating equitable, diverse, inclusive, and most importantly, and this is the one I think people forget, welcoming workplaces and industries is all our responsibility. Now, I also want to hear from the current sports media people and the future generation, and Richard Coffey, who's one of our sport media students just about to graduate, is also on the panel this year, as they're the change makers that we've all been needing and now have. And we want to talk now, not so much about awareness, but what actions are happening. Enough of awareness, we all say, and now it's time for actionable change. Thanks to the audience and everyone out there that's taking time to be part of this conversation. I take it away, Laurel, and the panel. I look forward to the conversation.
Great. Thank you, Joe. Okay, so let's start with that. The theme of today's conference is accountability revolution. And as Joe said, we're tired of awareness. And so we're all about action and change. The question is, what change are we looking for? And what does accountability mean? Scott, Devin, Anastasia, you want to start tackling that? First of all, what does accountability mean in sport to you?
Anastasia? Scott?
Great question. Let me think about that for 1 second. I mean, I can pass the mic to Devin or Scott, but I'm really happy with some of the trends we've seen, with excuse me, what's his name? Mr. Tom Brenneman, of course, using a gay slur, right? Like, I'm instantly, my mind goes there, where it's like, nope, that's just absolutely ridiculously unacceptable at this point in time. And it was unacceptable 20 years ago, but we just weren't quite there yet. And so to see just such swift action be taken in regards to that incident, I think that a lot of people might roll their eyes and go, cancel culture. And right now I'm like, you know what, guys, like, holding people accountable and responsible for their homophobic or transphobic or sexist remarks, like, we're just so far past that. And that has actually been a lovely thing to see this year. And I've also, I think I was speaking to Devin actually this morning, and I said, so much of what we're talking about is rooted so much in misogyny. And whether it be homophobia or transphobia, sexism. And I am actually really excited to just see the groundswell of support, in particular for the PWHPA right now, with male athletes supporting female athletes, using their voices in a way that haven't necessarily, they've used. Patrick Mahomes with NWSL, obviously his wife is an owner of one of the franchises there now, and just some of these larger male superstars coming out publicly and saying, we support this, product, and it's of value. And these are tremendous athletes that are in some cases even better than the male counterparts. I think that maybe that's a little bit of a digression from accountability, but those are some really positive things I've seen this year, actually, that I do celebrate as wins when we're talking and linking it back to homophobia, because I really do think that it's all linked.
Yeah, Scott, I don't think we can hear you. I don't know if you're on mute.
Devin, you saved me.
There you
We've
go.
only been in this pandemic for like 1.5 years, buddy. You don't know how to unmute.
The funny thing was, I was in on the conversation before we came live, so I must have hit mute at some point. So I do know how to work the system. I'll tell you that. But to pick up on another more recent topic, what Anastasia was saying, the Atlanta WNBA team is partially owned by Kelly Loeffler, the former Republican senator in Georgia who was defeated,
right,
in no small part because the very team she owns, the players stood up and really created an awareness for the need for the state of Georgia to flip the Senate. And don't think that doesn't matter. The way things have gone in the United States over the last 4+ years, and what happened in early January in Georgia was huge. So that is a form of accountability. The Tom Brenneman story hits me pretty closely because Tom Brenneman made his career calling the two sports that I love most,
right,
baseball and the National Football League. And you can't say what Tom Brenneman said, A, if you think it's going to go live over the air. I mean, that was in a commercial break. But B, you also can't say what Tom Brenneman said in the tone that he said it if you don't really mean what you say, and you don't say it a lot.
right.
And so one of the first things I thought after that whole Tom Brenneman, Cincinnati was the Reds were playing a game, and I think they might have been in between games of a doubleheader.
Yeah.
And they were going over scores or something they were going to talk about, and he referred to Kansas City as one of the FAG capitals of the world, and he inflected on FAG powerfully. And I thought, that wasn't supposed to go over the air. How many people, and even if it's just one, it's too many, how many people work behind the scenes for Fox Sports Ohio in the production truck? Maybe they're a camera person, whatever they do, who have heard this guy say something like that in their headsets
For years.
way too often. And so the accountability is, look, dude, we're not canceling Tom Brenneman. Tom Brenneman's made millions of dollars. And he may be trying to find alternate lines of work, like going and calling some winter baseball games in Puerto Rico because nobody else will hire him right now. Well, that's just accountability for your actions. And I think we've all seen this quote or something like it, which is equality for the marginalized can feel like oppression to those who've previously had the advantage. There are so many well-meaning people, but there are those who are trying to dig their nails into the wall and avoid scraping downward with cancel culture. We're not going to, trying to maintain the way things were. I don't know, Devin, Anastasia, Richard, you ever been in a newsroom? You ever been in an environment where you've been told you wouldn't have survived in the industry 30 years ago if that offends you? Oh, no, dude, you're not going to survive today if you think you can say those things. I would have survived 30 years ago. You're not going to survive today. And so that's what accountability is. If you slip up, doesn't mean we're tearing you down and you're never coming back, but it means there's a penance to pay. Because if you're not held accountable, then it's going to give permission for the next person to slip up, and we're just going to perpetuate this on and on and on. That's what accountability is. It's putting a stop to the unnecessary way things have been.
It's a brilliant thought, Scott, and thank you for that. And I couldn't agree more with you. And hello to everyone. It's great to see you all, and I hope you're all taking care of yourself, because I know for me it's been a struggle. So that's what I want to start with. I hope you're all taking care. Here's what I reflect on, Laurel, when you ask that question. The price for so long to be actionable, to hold to account, has been too great for too long, because in order to align words and saying you're taking a stand and actually doing it, that price has been too great. There's always been a disconnect. But I really believe that the scales tipped this summer, at least in the sporting domain, in the wake of the George Floyd incident, and when athletes and their activism rose up in a way that we have never seen before. Because for the first time, maybe ever, and we've seen maybe individual instances, but the Colin Kaepernick experience tells us that he was demonized for taking a stand. But we saw space created, a united front by athletes for the first time ever, where they understood their privileged position and enough was enough. And when those scales tipped, and you saw that united front, and let's be very clear that it was once again women and the WNBA who led that and didn't get proper credit for that, but it was the WNBA who led that, walking off the court, the powerful stance they took. Who can ever forget the bullet holes in the back of the t-shirts when they were there? And what that did is it signaled to the world, and it signaled to everyone who was too afraid to align words with actions, that this is no longer going to be the way. And so for me, that's what I think about here, is that the price for too long to take action, to hold people to account, has been too great, because those in positions of power is pushed down, just silence. That's changed. And I want to believe that there's no turning back. Of course, that could change. And of course, there's still a lot of work to do, but I really believe that the scales have tipped in a positive way.
So I would agree with you that there's been some great change, and that the scales are tipping. I'm still not convinced that they're tipped. I think they are tipping, and we're seeing this more and more. So we're also speaking to a number of students today. I think we have about 100 students here listening in, and we also have Richard Coffey's in 4th year graduating, going to journalism school at Carleton, right, Richard?
Yeah. Yeah.
Congratulations. So pretty exciting. So this is for you, hearing from Anastasia, Scott, and Devin, and seeing, seeing you graduating, going into the industry. Do you feel as though, what do you feel, let me ask this, what do you feel like you're going into? Do you feel as though the scales are tipped, or do you feel like you're going into an environment of acceptance, and, or at least that you have more allies in the space, or you have community members, and or even profs or your friends, or everyone that is supportive around you? Or how are you feeling now compared to when you were playing hockey, and that hockey was a home for you until you realized that you were gay?
Well, I feel like it's a bit what you said, like it's tipping, but at the same time, there's always constantly more work to do. Like I feel like, at least for my generation, is one of the most open generations when it comes to the idea of sexuality and different sexual orientations. But at the same time, that's on the broad level of ideal. When we're looking at this into the world of sports, it is still there's a lot of work that's still necessary to be done in the world of sports to bring it even close to like the rest of and that's what I tried to write about when I was doing. But when I look at people like Scott and Devin and Anastasia, and sort of like how in like the Canadian sport media landscape, they're almost like the trailblazers, so to speak, at least in a public facing aspect. You realize that there's a lot of change, and there's a lot of growth, but like there still is a lot of necessary growth that needs to be done.
Okay, so we're seeing that. Let's take a look at growth, or perhaps actually let's take a look at curling. So I would also say here that there has been this tipping of the scale, Devin, here, the history being made at the Briar this year when 2 openly gay members of the LGBTQ community were skips playing against each other. And I kept hearing from Joe and text, this is huge, this is huge. So when we talk about representation matters, and also the fact that 2 openly gay members in the LGBTQ community playing against each other, why is that so huge? And why is it that we should also be celebrating that representation matters?
Well, first of all, we should always be celebrating curling, so thank you for that. Listen, John Epping, the Ontario skip, and Greg Smith, the skip out of Newfoundland and Labrador, they are charismatic, they are courageous, and they are wonderful leaders in the sport of curling. 2 people who I call friends, 2 people who are unabashedly and unafraid to be themselves. It was such a seminal moment at this year's Briar. I've always believed that curling, at least in the LGBTQ space, has been inclusive, not so much when it comes to diversity. And I've taken a lot of heat about that, a lot of work to be done in curling. So that's worth mentioning. But yeah, I mean, you see these 2, you see them holding the pride flag all over social media. You see publications like Bar Down covering that. It's important because, listen, I grew up in Saskatoon curling. And here's a little bit of a story that I don't think I've ever shared before. We were in our grade 12 team, high school champions, by the way. It's my curling claim to fame. I was a third. My skip and I, we were both gay, and we weren't openly gay, but we in Saskatoon ended up showing up at the only gay bar in Saskatoon years later and looked at each other, and we were on the same team, and we were so damn afraid. And we would be on road trips. And, I've done so much reporting on these coming out stories, and I know my colleagues have as well. And we all have our own experience, who have talked about how not being authentic has affected their performance in sport. And I think about, I've reflected about that often, because if not being authentic in the field of play is affecting your performance, what does that mean for day-to-day life? And so when we reflect on John and Greg playing in a national championship, nationally televised, hundreds of thousands of people watching, I think about myself and my skip, who were horrified to be who we were on the ice. And I think about what that would have meant to us when we were playing, to be able to feel like we were in a safe space. And I often wonder what that would have meant for us in our athletic careers. You know, Scott talks about Tom Brenneman, and that I had to cover it for the National, but I also wrote a very personal piece about the fact that hearing those slurs forced me out of hockey. I quit hockey and I hated it. But when you have the representation, when you have images of two skips on the national spotlight being authentically themselves, it's a game changer, and that cannot be underestimated. So I'm proud of the curlers. We should also mention Dustin Kidby from Saskatchewan, whom was the first openly gay curler in a Brier in 2017, when the Brier was held in St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador as well. So it's crucial, and it can be life-saving, not to be overstated.
So I'd like to, I know that we gave a number of topics for today, but I do think you just triggered my memory of something from last year. And Scott, two things. This will come to for Scott first, and then Anastasia. Scott, last year, or when I first met you, maybe it was September 2019, I think. And in July that year, you had publicly come out as gay. And then we met you a couple of months later, and you, Joe, and I sat in a room for what was supposed to be an hour and ended up being 3 hours. It was I still have goosebumps from your stories and in hearing, you know, some of the as you said, like in safe environments and what you were going through. So we then had you on the show, on February 2020. 14 months later, almost 2 years later in July. Tell me how things have changed for you, because then you also said in terms of like being afraid to speak out, being afraid to come out. Now you've had time to pass. You have been addressing many issues. Where are you today that you weren't a year ago?
Oh, wow. I mean, I've been living the same life that we all have in the middle of this pandemic, which has forced a lot of us into our homes. Personally speaking, I have a wonderful boyfriend named Xander, who is highly, highly emotionally intelligent. And so he has stayed with me and worked with me through some of the early challenges of our relationship due to the damage of a lot of the way I had been living my life. You can't live the life I've lived, and I won't speak for Devin or Anastasia or Richard. They can share their own stories. You can't live the life I've lived without having very, very high and unscalable walls. And so with my boyfriend's help, with the support of my family, with the support of my therapist, who I continue to see sometimes once a week, sometimes twice a month, depending. I've chipped away at some of this stuff. And I'm learning what it is to feel feelings and actually allow myself to feel them, to love, to be loved, to not, I don't know for a better way to put it than to say, to not disassociate. For a lot of my life, I felt like I was standing over myself, watching me and pulling some puppet strings. This is how I'm supposed to move. This is how I'm supposed to speak. This is how I'm supposed to behave. And so a lot of that has changed. We've all, like I said, been forced indoors, so maybe we're not seeing as much of each other as we would like, but this has been a really important time for me And as I think about where we're going to go here, and the fingers are crossed that life is going to return to normal, and that the next time we all do this, we're going to be in a room together again. I really want to commend you, Laurel and Joe and Ryerson, because as we move toward activation and step away from awareness, and whether that's accountability or making sure that we're adequately represented, this is grassroots.
Mm-hmm.
If you are a child, if you are a teenager, we need to live in a world where who you are is okay. And if you've got a high-pitched laugh and you're an 8-year-old boy, you're not getting run off your team because you're being bullied, that you have the support that you need, that you're not scared to play football or rugby or baseball or hockey or soccer, or you name the sport in high school, because you're trying to hide a secret that you don't want to get exposed. You can be you through your formative years. And if you have a passion in the way that Devin and Anastasia and Richard and I and others do for the industry that we're in, you can be you in our industry. And I think our commitment, I will speak for the panel on this front, our commitment is to support you being you. You now have allies who have openly identified within the industry, and we will support you on through your process. And if we're able to, we'll work with you on your craft, like whatever the case may be. We want to be supportive to the next generation, because the life experience I've lived could make me bitter. It could make me want better for others. And what I'm grateful for is that I feel like, especially over the last 14, 15 months, it's made me want better for others. And so let's move ahead toward a better world and contribute to that, and make sure people can just be people. There's a space for you and your perspective. And we got different perspective because we've had to be tough since we were really, really little. There's a space for everybody in our industry. And I think where the numbers grow in terms of LGBTQ plus representation in our industry is at that youthful grassroots level. You take your love, your passion, you go to school, you learn the craft, you step into the industry, and you grow. And all of a sudden, 20 or 30 years from now, you're running the places where you started your career. That's how representation grows. We can't just cherry pick people who've never done this before and say, would you like to run a radio station? Well, if you don't have that experience, you're not qualified to do it. So we grow from the grassroots up. And I'm really hopeful that by the time I'm drooling into my soup in an old folks home at 90 years old, I'll be able to see a ton of LGBTQ plus representation in our industry.
Hear, 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 hear.
Yes.
Awesome.
So this is, I'm happy to hear that Scott, and again, I like to look at metrics on things and data on things, but then of course our own personal shared stories and our own personal experiences. So Anastasia, Russia Olympics, Sochi Olympics, you were very vocal, and in terms of what was going on for LGBTQ rights, and took a stand. Now we're facing the same issues in Tokyo for 2021 Olympics, and that there being this push by athletes and others, organizations, saying that we need to push for the equality law around LGBTQ plus issues, and that we're not going to be standing around and letting the Japanese government and governing bodies push back and have this, we're gonna resist change. We're gonna discriminate against LGBTQ community. This now is actually on the center stage. You were very vocal about this before. How do you see when you were vocal before to today, and what's going on with the Olympics and the change that has occurred or not?
What a time to be alive, eh?
Yeah.
Like, I'm like, oh my gosh, I have so much coming at me. I do think that there has been a change at the Olympic level. And you had said first and foremost the tipping point, and I would ask, I guess, to my fellow, without trying to derail this question, but does everyone think there's been a tipping point in sports or sport media, or are they the same thing?
I think my gut instinct to that is that they're probably trying to run parallel to one another. And I think that they're probably trying to keep up to one another. And I think newsrooms, you and I work at CBC Sports. I think the conversation in our newsroom is very different today than it was even a couple of years ago. So that's how I would answer that.
Go ahead, please.
I'll just jump in very quickly to not take Anastasia's time. I still think in terms of the male professional sports, we can't sit here and believe truthfully that there aren't gay baseball players, hockey players, football players, basketball players, soccer. Well, Colin Martin is a wonderful example, but on down the list, the so-called Big Four,
right,
which for better or for worse gets most of the attention on shows like mine. I'll cop to that. That's part of how it is, at least right now. But there are no out athletes. So there are gay athletes, LGBTQ plus athletes, but they're not out. So there is still a fear there somewhere. And so we still have we may be toward a precipice, but I don't know if we've tipped it far enough.
Richard, do you have any thoughts? I just would love to hear.
I was completely agree with what Scott was saying, because like my understanding is based in hockey, is my main sport. So there's a lot of idealism of what we like to believe change is change in a sport like hockey, but I think it's not where it's not actually where we'd like to. Sometimes we like to think it actually is.
And I mean, all of those insights were brilliant. And I sorry, that was a long, convoluted way to say, I think that there are aspects of the Olympic movement that have changed for the better, 100%. When I came out in Sochi, which feels like a lifetime ago, and I'm not good at math, but I think it was in and around 7.5 years ago. Like people didn't even know how to have the conversation, right? Like the athletic community, and I say this with love in my heart and a little bit of tough love in my heart. A lot of people supported, but they didn't necessarily understand why I came out. They didn't know how to be an ally. They didn't know how to, talk about things or to further the conversation. And I do think that has shifted. I think that we are quite a bit more comfortable having this conversation, recognizing diversity and, calling discrimination for what it is. I think going back to your point about accountability, I think that has changed and shifted for the better, especially in the Olympic realm. I think where we still say, we're still struggling, as Scott points out, is in those Big Four. And it really has to link back again to toxic masculinity. I recognize that term shuts sometimes people off from this conversation, and that is not my intention to say that. But I think any of those sports that really play in and around of like really, really set gender norms, and you have to wear a boring gray suit to the game. I love watching the NBA boys show up in the most fabulous outfits. And I think that's why you're seeing kind of the relevance of the NBA and basketball and the Raptors in, just all of society, because they do link to fashion, they do link to music. Whereas I think a lot of hockey's struggles are that they're showing up in the boring gray suits still, and it's just a game, and they're staying in their lane. And, again, to a few points that have been made, like shut up and dribble, that died. Like that is so far gone, So in regards to Japan and Tokyo, of course, I think we are in a better position. I think that there's still tremendous work to be done. But I think the fact that people are showing up and they feel empowered use their voice and to say, we're not going to be bystanders and what we're seeing is wrong. I think that's made all the difference, at least at the Olympic level. Are we there yet? No. You know, there's obviously sensitivities around that, and every athlete has, you know, their right to stay in the closet or to come out. You know, I'm the first person to say, you got to do you. Like, that is the fastest way to make change, is to live yourself, live your life to the best of your ability and be yourself authentically. And some people feel like they need to make a grand statement. Some people don't. And that's so personal. And I support anyone's decision to keep quiet. But really, I think comparing Sochi to Japan, we have seen a lot of improvement. Are we there completely? No, but we're showing up to this conversation equipped to have the conversation in a way that was not reality 7 years ago. And, you know, 7 years, yeah, I get sick of my own voice sometimes, telling my own story. I'm like, oh my gosh, like, I'm not that interesting. But I do think that it takes time for change to seep in. And in 7 years, we've actually seen quite a progress. I will say that. And I'm proud to say that.
Go ahead.
Just really quickly, just a really quick point. I think what we should really pay attention to in terms of accountability and actionable items at these Olympics, we'll learn very shortly. Rule 50 has been very contentious with the IOC. Rule 50 banning all athletes at the Olympics from any display of protests. Of course, we saw that come to a head with the USOC. They're now saying all of their qualifiers, athletes can take a stand, whether it be a flag, whether a fist in the air, whatever they want to do. And I think people watching this should really pay attention to see how Rule 50 plays out in Tokyo, because that's going to give us a very good metric of how far, as Anastasia says, we've actually come, because that really at the end of the day is what we're talking about. An athlete in the field of play on the biggest athletic stage, being able to show up fully and really show the world what they believe in.
So let's talk about Rule 50 for a moment, because this is all about accountability. Who is accountable for Rule 50?
Powerful men.
Yeah, the IOC.
Yeah, the IOC, powerful men. The let's call it for white masculinity. And so when we think, so saying please, so basically just for the audience, then Devin, could you maybe just outline in a sentence or two Rule 50 for the audience in terms of they're saying banning the right to be able to protest at the Olympics, on making it political essentially, which is kind of strange, because I would argue that the Olympics should be called political Olympics in some cases.
They've always been political. And I mean, you go back to 1968 and that iconic photo of Tommy Smith and John Carlos with their fists raised. And, you know, obviously Rule 50 is going to be inextricably linked to that. But of course, and they were demonized. I want to point that out. They were demonized. They were banned from the USOC, from track, all of that. Now they've been put up statues and are heralded as heroes. So keep that in mind, history and how we remember things. But Rule 50, yeah, quite simply bans any Olympian from making a political stance in the field of play, whether it be a flag, whether it be a symbol, whether it be a fist, whether it be a knee. And so there's been a lot of consultation. I've actually tried to hold the IOC to account by asking, where is this process at? They told us there would be a result of an athlete survey about a month ago, and it's radio silence, and tomorrow marks 100 days from Tokyo. So if you have faith in things changing and the power being in the athlete's hands, not so much the case.
Okay, so that's why I wanted to, this is such a great example of accountability, because we've seen the power and the influence of athletes in sports. And as you said, the WNBA women athletes were the women who were leading this. The NBA athletes standing up and Colin Kaepernick taking a knee. So we see these social justice movements and how incredibly powerful and impactful they can be on audiences, on sport organizations, on sponsors, on media organizations. So this is again holding to task not just the IOC, but I look at this also and say, listen, sponsors, where are you in this? Why is it that somebody can't take a knee? Why is it that somebody can't have some sort of social gesture for a social justice movement? And on top of that, you know, again, you're all you all work in the media, broadcasters. I would even say to our broadcasters, and I'm not asking you to comment necessarily on that because those are your employers, but where's their accountability in Rule 50? So maybe we'll talk about the sponsors, but it's not just the IOC. There's so many stakeholders that are funding this on this Rule 50. Where's our accountability? Because also I think it's actually unfair to put all of the weight on the athletes.
Yeah, and it has always been that way. And I think what we're talking about here is obviously money, money, money. And one of the fascinating things for me, which I was paying close attention to, is when we were in the midst of the pandemic and the bubble, and it was such a heightened atmosphere in the wake of George Floyd. And then you saw the groundswell of protests and the athletes coming together, shutting down the sports world in an unparalleled way. I was fascinated to see whether or not that level of activism would still be intact when things sort of got back to normal, because we know money rules the day. So there are two different things going on here. Olympians maybe don't have as much power as a pro athlete in that sense. So when you look at sponsors, when you look at the Olympics, when you look at the power of the IOC, and Anastasia, I don't want to speak for Olympians, I'll never be one, that's why I'm a reporter, but there are story after story of Olympians and high performance athletes feeling like they are not a part of the conversation at all. And yet we're talking about Olympic ideals. We're talking about this all being cloaked in humanity and bringing people together. There's a real disconnect there. So when you talk about sponsors, I mean, we have seen some instances where, you know, I think of even the Men's World Hockey Championship supposedly going to Belarus, and then you had sponsors pull out, and then suddenly we're not going there anymore. So, you know, sponsors play a massive role in this, and athletes have to be putting the pressure on the sponsors some of the time, but the sponsors have to shoulder some of that as well. But you also look at who are the owners. Who are the owners of all of these sports teams? CBC Sports did an audit of the big four sports and the positions of power, the 4 positions of power: coach, president, general manager, all of that. An overwhelming 90 to 95% of the owners in the pro sports leagues are white men. Blind spots abound in pro sports, and you're only as good as who's at the table. Scott.
Well, and fear can be a wonderful motivator. And so my question would be, because I don't have the answer to this, is what strikes fear into the IOC? And it would be the loss of sponsorship, but then what strikes fear into those sponsors? If you look at the Major League Baseball decision to remove the All-Star game from Atlanta, Georgia this summer, it will instead be played in Denver, Colorado, as a response to Georgia's changing of the laws to essentially encourage voter suppression, to make it more difficult for Black people in the state of Georgia to vote. Major League Baseball didn't have any kind of come to Jesus moment here. Coca-Cola and Delta Airlines, two of Georgia's, two of America's biggest corporations who happen to be based in Georgia, spoke up and said something needs to change here. And so that pressure instilled some fear in Major League Baseball. What also instilled fear in Major League Baseball was the notion that players from 30 Major League Baseball teams would be converging on Atlanta for what's supposed to be a fun little 3-day spectacle and break in the middle of summer, being pounded with questions about these very issues: equality, the Georgia voter suppression laws, etc. The fear paralyzed Major League Baseball temporarily. And then they said, we'd rather deal with the criticism for the next week or two for removing the game from Atlanta, for removing the game from Georgia. We'll deal with that for the next little bit, but then we're not going to have to deal with the groundswell come summer. So the result, the punishment of the state of Georgia is good, but the intent from Major League Baseball's perspective, in my opinion, is lacking. Fear drove it. I just wonder where the fear mechanisms lie in the whole sponsorship, IOC, the media involvement, athletes who are typically individuals and not always well funded. It's very different going to a Winter Olympics as an NHL hockey player than it is to have come up in a sport as an individual that's not particularly well funded. I wonder where the fear mechanisms are that can get movement from these coddled, aristocratic, rich, typically white people who control all of this.
So this, you happen to agree. I do want to get a question in because this question is related. It's from the audience, related to this topic. When, and actually it's at the top, when Maury from the IOC made extremely offensive sexist remarks, it almost seemed like he was going to get away with it. Why does, and well, I would argue he still got away with it. Why does it take them so long to respond? How can we do our part to pressure them to make real change? And again, it's coming back to the economics. And so if we were to make this about monetization, we talked about this actually earlier today, and in terms of a gender and equity one, it still comes down to the monetization and the economics sometimes in these decisions, and the fear that you're talking about, Scott. I actually, I'd like to put it back at you for a moment, because you're so good at asking questions. That's what you do for your job as well. Is I'd like to ask back, I'd like you to go deeper and think about, what do you think that fear is? Fear of loss of job? Fear of
yeah, I mean, if you were to protest in violation of Rule 50 and you're a medalist, are you stripped of your medal? I would imagine a protest of the individual being stripped of their medal would probably usurp the protest of the athlete. Maybe they end up getting the medal back, and that's how you push back. I do think it's fear. I think sometimes too, and I'll personalize it, is sometimes we feel like, oh my God, we got to speak out again. I got to be the guy. I got to be the guy to say this about that. And, I'm going to be told that I'm an FAG, or you're trying to cancel somebody, or you're this, or you're that. Like, I think that's part of it, is how many battles can we fight, and where is our exhaustion level? So I do think it's, they're just going to say, well, there's that guy again, right? And whether that's an athlete or whomever, there's that person going on about that thing that they always go on about. Oh yeah, we got to change the world. So I think we end up sometimes gaslighting ourselves and tricking ourselves into believing that we don't have the energy for this, or gosh, I'm going to have to wear these negative comments again. I'm going to have to open my DMs on Twitter where I'm being told to bleep off or whatever. I think that's a part of it. And so that's why I get back to, we need allies. We need straight people, well-intended straight people, to step up. In the Tom Brenneman situation, a couple of national baseball reporters who I am friends with, whom I've met along the path through my years of travel, very well-intended, very bright people, caring people, said, well, Tom, he shouldn't lose his job for the rest of his life for this. And I'm like, that's the default setting. People are on our side, except they want to negotiate the punishment, right? And so I think it's just this constant sort of climb uphill, that there's a fear of being that person again, And there's that fear of that pushback where I'm so exhausted responding to the same things all the time, the same pushbacks, even from well-intended people. I think there's a kind of it gets tiring. And I can only imagine what it would be like for an athlete with an international stage in Japan.
So as we're talking about LGBTQ community plus community, I do want to say this, Scott, you made a comment saying we need straight allies. And I'm saying, yes, you need straight allies, but you also need decision makers who are gay at the top.
I agree.
Agreed.
But in the meantime.
Yes. And so I'd like to, I know there's a lot of questions rolling in and we're not going to have time. We've got 10 minutes. I just want to do a 10-minute. I do want to ask Richard. I want to jump in here with Richard as well. And Richard, in terms of, let's say, maybe some changes in what you see happening in the university landscape here, Ryerson RTA Sport Media specifically, and what you're learning in the classroom, in terms of you see script writing, you see what your fellow students are doing to become potentially on-air talent. You're seeing behind the scenes camera people, production. Do you feel well, first of all, and maybe this is too personal, let me know, do you feel safe in the environment when you came out? Do you feel safe today? And what do we need to do more in our environment to make it more safe and more inclusive and also more accountable? Because we need to learn, not just myself, I mean, I'm pointing at myself too, but as a community, what can we do?
Well, I'll be fair. I came out publicly at right early during second year a couple years ago at Ryerson. So when I thought of that, I had already seen for a year people in the program, people who are learning, and what I've seen is, and I don't necessarily think it's across the board, but I do think at Ryerson there is a lot of good stuff in terms of how RTA handles it. There's a lot. It's a lot of trying to, and some of it it still needs to be obviously improved. It's a lot of trying. There is people trying to make sure different voices are heard, and there is people trying to make sure to be held accountable for when people mess up in terms of doing that. But I do think, at least in the couple of years since 2018, I've seen relatively positive things from the RTA community.
Okay, that's good to hear. I mean, I'm sure that I'm not sure. I know that we all have a lot of work to do, and but I also it's good to hear that from you, being in the community and a key contributing member in our community. So okay, we have 7-8 minutes left, and so I'd like just to open this up. I know there's a lot of questions. I don't think we're going to get too many of them, but let's talk about what we need to continue to do. There was an article by Eric Dennison. He's actually Canadian, who's out of Monash University in Australia, and he does talk about does LGBTQ plus pride games stop homophobic language in sport? In fact, actually, out of this article, I can say overwhelmingly the answer is yes. So that was really great news out of this research, of course. So that was great, because you see there's a lot of academics doing research in this space and trying to move the agenda forward. Part of us bringing together is also to bring scholarship and industry together. So let's talk, if we could just make a 1-minute comment on what we think we need to do as a community to continue to move the discussion forward, stop homophobic language in the locker room, stop homophobic language on the field, and whether you're on air or you're not, or your mic is hot or it's not, what do we all need to continue to do to move this forward, to continue to mobilize change and ultimately impact and inclusion? Devin?
Well, here's what I'll say. I have a couple of loose thoughts, and I've been looking at the questions as well, so I want to address that really quickly as well. But what I'm heartened by in this conversation today, that I find different from 14 months ago, is the intersectionality the crossover of all groups of minority and all suppression they face, and how together we are in all of this. And hasn't that been part of the conversation today, where we're talking about the protests this summer, when we're talking about misogyny, when we're talking about homophobia in sport, there's an understanding more than ever about the intersectionality between all of this. So I'm heartened about that. I didn't jump, and I'm mad at myself for not jumping at your question, Laurel, about what we need to do as broadcasters. A great question from Peter here about, as a journalist with a following, how do you strike a balance? We're supposed to be objective, but I'm a gay sports reporter. It is very challenging. Inside the CBC Sports newsroom, though, I am fearless now in challenging the old guard. We have a lot of white, powerful men in the CBC Sports department. I am unafraid to challenge them. Anastasia has my back in all of those meetings. We're there. We're the sharks in every meeting. They know we're ready to pounce. And so I would say to everyone listening, it is a horrifying exercise that takes great courage in the depths of all that you are to, in that moment of decision, define your destiny as somebody who's willing to speak out in those moments. And so I would encourage all of you to be unafraid in those moments where you know in your gut instinctually that this is a moment to speak out. It is in those individual interactions that we create change. This is not a one day, one conversation thing, but in each of those moments where in your heart you know this is a moment, take them. Be fearless. That's what I'll say.
How do I follow that? Like, I seriously, I'm like, I could just listen. I've been so quiet and I'm usually so obnoxiously extroverted, but I'm so honored to be on this panel with my colleagues here. Yeah, I mean, I do think Scott mentioned it, that a lot of change happens at the grassroots level. And I am so excited. I've done a few speeches, I've connected with students, and some of my stories, like it actually gives me, it really makes me happy, because I'll retell my story and some of my struggles from coming out of the closet, and I'll go, wow, like that's just not how it is anymore, at least in their experience. And that makes me happy, because it makes me painfully reminded that I'm getting older, and hopefully some aspects of my story are going the way of the dodo bird. And that's why we're having this panel, so that we don't have to have the panel hopefully in 15, 10, 5 years. I would say be yourself. We all, whether it's your orientation, whether it's your expression, be yourself, lean into yourself, and do the job to the best of your ability and follow your passions. I sound like I'm Tony Robbins, and it's cliched, but honestly, like, it is the fastest way to make a difference. Love what you do and be proud of yourself. And it takes time. God, I still struggle to be proud of some of my story and what I bring to the table. And Devin said it, it's hard sometimes to be objective. I have my own frailties. I have my own biases, and I'm trying to be self-reflexive and work on them and educate them and educate myself. But I mean, I really do believe that change is going to come from the grassroots swell. But I also am very happy to say that, someone said to me, and I've said this line a few times, so I'm getting almost self-conscious, because I think I'm going to sound like Lady Gaga with the 100 people in the room kind of quote. Mm-hmm. But someone said to me, when this stupid pandemic started, pandemics don't ever break anything. They just show you what was already broken. And I think the people that have been attentive and listening, they have identified what was broken, and we are coming to those conversations armed and equipped and with open hearts and open minds. And, I have to believe that when people are trying to make themselves better and to educate themselves, that it's just such an integral step to making this world better. And I think this panel is, proof of that. And, just try and be proud. And it takes a moment, but live your life to the best of your ability. Be proud of who you are, self-love, internal satisfaction, and then do your job to the best of your ability, because that is the fastest way to connect with people and to make effective change. And it's easier said than done, but I'm a fan. And if anyone needs to reach out, just reach out to me on social media, and I'll give you all my tips and tricks. Not that I have it all figured out, that's for sure.
So we're sitting at 5 on the hour. So Anastasia, if you're going to drop off, please
Thank you.
feel free to. But we actually did this on purpose, and I do want to stick to 5. And I know that Joe is probably having a heart attack being in production and being like, Laurel, you're over. But we actually scheduled Ivan Joseph for 5:05 because I knew this was going to happen. I do want to hear from Scott, and I would like to hear from Richard, and then we will sign off. You have 1 minute each. Scott.
Okay, so I'm going to do to you, Laurel, what you don't like, which is I'm gonna pivot the question or take my answer in a bit of a different direction.
Please do.
We have a responsibility as an LGBTQ plus community to be aware of all of our letters, and the T in LGBTQ plus right now is suffering badly, not just in sports, but in particular individualized states in the United States of America, with some of the laws that are being passed by typically Republican state governments. And transgender people face burdens is too light a word. Atrocities is probably a more appropriate descriptor. Transgender people are feeling the effects of laws being passed against their personhood, similar to what gay men, lesbian women dealt with 35, 40 years ago and pushed back against. And the transgender community needs our support, vocal support. They need us to stand with them. And so I think that for all of the gains that we have made, there are people who matter who need our help. And we need to be always consciously aware of that. More generally speaking, I don't know if you can teach others empathy if they don't have it, but be receptive to others' stories, personal experiences, be willing to listen and share yours. And typically you will find that through communication, positive, healthy communication, you as well as somebody else can learn a lot.
So on that, thank you. Today, one of my PhD students in an earlier panel wanted to make sure that we make a comment. I had it written down here: trans women are women, trans men are men. And so happen to agree with you, Scott, on that as well, and that the trans community needs our support as well. Richard.
And I guess if I'm on this panel to like represent the next generation, in that sense, I guess what I would say is and just amplify what Scott said, one of the easiest and best steps to take is it's the openness to hear people's stories, to hear people's experiences, and if possible, and like I agree with Scott, you can't necessarily teach empathy, but if you have it, the ability to have empathy for people's stories, because when we see all the different stories, we realize how not different we all actually are when you actually see all the different stories people have, and that's one of the easiest ways to not only just be an ally, but just be a good person in general, just to be empathetic and open to what people's experiences are.
Yes, is it that difficult to be kind, it obviously is. But listen, I will say, let's sign off now. Thank you so much, Devin, Scott, Anastasia, and Richard, and of course, Joe Recupero for originally coming up with this vision for Out on Air. Thank you for attending the GXS Lab Accountability Revolution in Sport Media Conference. I do encourage you to go to check out the videos that are on demand. We have another live show with Dr. Ivan Joseph, who's going to be doing the closing remarks from the day. Thank you again for participating in this Out on Air panel, and we'll see you soon, hopefully all in person. If not, we definitely doing this panel in 2021, 22. We skipped a year. Okay, all the best, everyone. Take care. Thank you.
Thank you.